The screaming silence. It wasn't the house that first unsettled me. It was the garden. The sprawling, untamed garden that surrounded our new home like a wild beast. When my wife and I bought the place, we were enchanted by its old-world charm, the way the vines curled around the wrought iron fence, and the roses bloomed in chaotic beauty. But as the days passed, I began to notice that the garden felt different at night. Wrong somehow. The silence was the first clue. It wasn't the peaceful stillness of a quiet evening. It was oppressive, like something was sucking the sound out of the air. No wind rustled the leaves, no insects chirped, no animals moved through the undergrowth. The garden was as still as a graveyard. I mentioned it to my wife, Sarah, but she just shrugged it off. "You're overthinking it," she said, her laughter light as she placed another flower pot on the porch. "It's just a garden. You should appreciate the quiet." But it wasn't just quiet. It was too quiet. One night, I couldn't sleep. The oppressive silence weighed on me, pressing in on all sides like a suffocating blanket. I got up, pulled on my robe, and decided to take a walk through the garden. Maybe fresh air would clear my head, dispel the gnawing sense of dread that had settled in my bones since we moved in. The garden was eerily still as I stepped outside. The full moon cast long, twisted shadows across the lawn, turning the flowers into ghostly figures, swaying in the breeze that didn't exist. As I walked along the overgrown path, my footsteps were too loud, too distinct. Every sound seemed to echo back at me, unnaturally sharp in the thick, silent air. Then I heard it, a scream, long, drawn out, and agonizing. But it wasn't coming from a person, it was coming from the garden itself. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, adrenaline flooding my veins. The sound wasn't human. It was a low, guttural wail that seemed to rise from the ground beneath my feet, reverberating through the earth and into my bones. It didn't stop. It just went on, a relentless, tortured sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I stood there, rooted to the spot, staring into the twisted shadows of the garden, trying to locate the source of the sound. But there was nothing. Just darkness and the looming presence of the garden itself, as if the plants were watching me, waiting. Suddenly, the scream stopped. The silence that followed was worse, an awful, buzzing emptiness that made my ears ring. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I realized I was sweating, cold beads of it running down my back despite the chill in the air. I turned to go back inside, my heart still pounding, but something stopped me. A movement, barely a flicker, caught the corner of my eye. I turned toward it, squinting into the darkness near the far edge of the garden. There, standing among the roses, was a figure. At first I thought it was Sarah. She loved tending to the flowers, even at odd hours. But as I stepped closer, I realized the figure was too tall, too thin. Its limbs were elongated, unnatural, and its face was obscured by shadow. It stood perfectly still, not moving, not even swaying like the flowers around it. I stopped in my tracks, every instinct screaming at me to turn around and get out. But I couldn't move. My feet were glued to the spot, my breath catching in my throat. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if it had noticed me. Then it began to move, not walk, but glide toward me, the long grass parting in its wake. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest. But the figure moved faster, its form becoming clearer as it drew closer. Its face, now visible in the moonlight, was blank. No eyes, no mouth, no features at all. Just smooth, pale skin stretched over a human-shaped frame, and yet I could hear the screaming again. It wasn't coming from the figure, but from inside my head. The same low, guttural wail, vibrating through my skull, louder and louder, until it drowned out every other thought. I clutched my ears, trying to block it out, but it only grew louder, more intense, as if the garden itself was inside me now, screaming through my very bones. I stumbled back toward the house, my vision blurring, my head pounding with the relentless noise. The door was just ahead, but it felt like miles away. I ran, or at least I thought I did, but it felt like I wasn't moving, like I was stuck in some nightmarish limbo where the house receded into the distance as the figure got closer and closer. I turned, gasping for breath, and the garden was empty. The figure was gone. The silence had returned, thicker and more oppressive than before, but there was no sign of the thing I had just seen. I burst through the door, slamming it behind me, my heart still racing. Sarah was standing at the bottom of the stairs, her brow furrowed in concern. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft and worried. I nodded, though my hands were still trembling. "The garden, there's something out there," she frowned, glancing out the window. "It's just a garden," she said quietly. "You need to rest." But I knew what I had seen, what I had heard. The garden was alive. It was watching, waiting, and it wanted something from me. Something I wasn't willing to give. That night I lay in bed, listening to the silence, waiting for the screaming to start again. And I knew deep down that the garden wouldn't stay quiet for long.